Bonjour et bienvenue à tous pour la deuxième conférence de la professeure Shimazu Naoko du Tokyo College, dont elle est la vice-directrice, et avec lequel le Collège de France a une convention qui fonctionne très bien, comme peut en témoigner le professeur Hublin, ici présent. Je salue également la présence du professeur Robert, éminent japonologue, qui s'occupe d'habitude de choses plus anciennes, mais bien. Alors, donc la dernière fois, la professeure Shimazu nous a entretenu de façon vraiment tout à fait fascinante de la façon dont les conscrits japonais de la guerre russo-japonaise de 1904-1905, comment ça a été vu à travers donc les journaux personnels de certains de ces conscrits, en tout cas ceux qui savaient s'exprimer par écrit. Et aujourd'hui, elle va aborder donc un thème qui a été beaucoup traité, que nous connaissons en particulier à travers la littérature et le cinéma, hein, le mythe du héros de guerre, en particulier dans sa forme divinisée. Donc, je laisse la parole donc à...
So you can hear me? Yes, thank you. So anyway, thank you very much for your very kind introduction, Professor Cheng. And I am most honored to be here, back again for my second lecture, and to like to thank you, Professor Cheng, and the Collège de France for this incredible opportunity to give the lectures here. So, as you know, this is the second lecture in the series of 4, War and Peace, A Global History of Japan, 1904 to 1943. And today's theme is what you see here, the making of the heroic war myth in modern Japan, which will offer an official perspective on the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05 by following the process of a heroic myth-making from the war. For those of you who attended my lecture last week on the war diaries of the Japanese conscripts, this is an occasion to discover the other side of the coin to the honorable war death, or la mort honorable de la guerre, as an official rhetoric. So I'm sorry again, I'm going to be speaking in English, but my slides are in French. So, this is the outline of today's lecture. So first of all, I will speak about the Commander Hirose's death. I will basically introduce him to you. And then I will go to speak about the architect of this Hirose myth, as I call it. And then, thirdly, we go on to talk about consolidation of Hirose's war hero status in the myth-making. And then, as an illustration of the official commemoration of this naval commander, I'm going to talk about the Hirose statue that was built in Tokyo. And then we go to the theme of Hirose as a popular cultural icon in Japanese society. And then, of course, he has to become a god, divinité de la guerre. And so we'll talk about that. And then lastly, we will reflect and say, why was it necessary for the Navy to create the Hirose myth? So, the Russo-Japanese War, as you may remember from last week, was fought between Japan and Russia from February 1904 to September 1905. Now, from February to May 1904, the Japanese Imperial Navy made 3 unsuccessful suicide missions. In Japanese, it's called keshitai, to blockade Port Arthur, which is on the Liaodong Peninsula, to prevent the movement of Russian ships in and out of this very important ice-free port. So after the unsuccessful attempts, naval attempts, basically the campaign shifts to land campaign, and which obviously turns into a very difficult and long battle. So finally, on the 2nd of January 1905, 11 months after the start of the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese captures Port Arthur. So, on the 27th of March 1904, the second blockade of Port Arthur was attempted by the Navy. Hirose, Takeo, Hirose is the last name, obviously, a naval commander, died during this dangerous blockade. So why was Hirose, who was an unknown naval officer, created into the most important heroic war myth of pre-1945 Japan? So how was this myth creation happen? What happened in the process? So essentially, today's lecture is really about the re-emergence of the cult of the warrior in modern Japan, but in a modernized form. Now, this is Commander Hirose, our hero today. So who was this man, Hirose? He was born in Bungo Taketa, which is a city in the Oita Prefecture in Kyushu. And he was born in 1868, which was the year of the Meiji Restoration. And he was the second son, and his mother unfortunately dies in his infancy. So his family home in this city is burnt down by the Satsuma during the Satsuma Rebellion, which is also known as the Seinan War of 1877. And as a result of this, his family moves to Hida Takayama, which is in the Gifu Prefecture, actually very close to Tokyo. So, and ironically, for a naval commander, this is one of the very few land-bound prefectures in Japan. So this is basically where he grows up after the age of 9, and his father becomes a judge in the court in this city, but in this area. Now, Hirose has a stint as a primary school teacher in the local school, but in 1885, he decides to go down to the Naval Academy called Edajima, near Hiroshima. And then, of course, he kind of goes through the training and he fights in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. And in 1897, which is 2 years after the end of the Sino-Japanese War, he is sent to Russia to study Russian. And he becomes, after a while, a naval attaché in the Japanese embassy in St. Petersburg. And so he lives in Russia for 5 years. And during this period, he actually travels around Russia and even visited Port Arthur. Now, in 1902, he is sent back to Tokyo. And so he dies in 1904, as you know, and he was 35 years old and not married. Now we're going to talk about the person who created the Hirose myth. So basically the creation of the Hirose myth was only possible because of the utter total determination of this one influential naval officer, the first Lieutenant Ogasawara Naganari. And he was de facto, well, not de facto, he was actually the official naval historian in the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. And he had a team of 50 people working with him to write various histories of the Japanese naval battles. So it's quite a big team, as you can imagine, 50 assistants, researchers working in this section under him. So he was the general editor of the Naval History of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. And then eventually, he obviously was also the editor of the history of the naval history of the Russo-Japanese War, which amounted to 147 volumes. And his team completed in 1911. Now, the Japanese war archives, they don't actually know where or if this complete series of 147 volumes exist. I was trying to look for them when I was doing this research, but in Japan there are bits and pieces of volumes in different locations, and we were not able to find the full complete volume, which is quite incredible if you think about it, because they must have published more than one series. They've published a number of them. And one of them was given to the British Royal Navy. So I haven't had time to go and check the archives, but it might be there. Now, so Ogasawara believed in the importance of an updated heroic war or heroic narrative for modern Japan, because it was no longer a good idea for modern Japan to follow medieval war heroes. Because as you probably know, Japan, because of the long period of warrior period in Japan, has very important medieval war heroes. So what he did was this, he actually, in some sense, thought like a historian. So he would have been an excellent student of history, and he would have become a professor of history, I'm sure. Because he emphasized his 50 people in his office that everybody had to collect primary sources, because evidence is the most important thing. And so he said, we've got to find any kind of piece of information that would help to create or write these heroic deeds of soldiers and sailors. And what he emphasized was the high-quality anecdotes and information in order to titillate popular interest. Now, Ogasawara paid special attention to the Port Arthur blockade missions because he had great potential for a tragic war death. The first blockade, which happened on the 23rd to the 24th of February, Ogasawara did not find a suitably heroic death, but he introduced the survivors of the mission, which included Hirose, our man, on the 5th of March, 1904. So as you see, he doesn't lose time. He was very quick in the turnaround of creating information for dissemination to the media. So the ground was now prepared for the heroic war myth to emerge, and his focus shifted to the forthcoming second blockade, where Hirose achieves the ideal war death in Ogasawara's eyes. So therefore, in Ogasawara, the Imperial Navy found the ideal architect and a choreographer who managed to orchestrate a very complex and detailed series of events, including public relations in creating and sustaining a heroic war myth. And because he lived a long life until 1958, after the Second World War, this meant that he was able to sustain his involvement in the Navy's institutional propaganda for much of the pre-war period. Now, So I kind of made a blueprint of how he created, the steps he took to create this Hirose myth. So number one, search for a suitable war death. Immediate official endorsement of heroic death. So when there is this, you look for one, and then when that death happens, you quickly turn it into an official endorsement. Now, the second stage, gather evidence quickly to centralize the heroic narrative. So the Navy will have control over how this myth develops eventually. And then disseminate bits of key information to the press. Not everything, but just the key information. And then thirdly, organize an official naval funeral process with the naval top brass, as well as imperial presence. Number four, integrate the Hirose myth into national education program, especially in the course of morals and ethics. Fifthly, support civic and public activities, especially the ones that are planned by the Imperial Reservist Association, which is created in 1910. So this is a veterans grassroots organization in Japan. And then sixthly, create commemorative statues in Tokyo and elsewhere, if possible. Seventhly, endorse select cultural activities, like, provide information for filmmaking, exhibitions, performance arts, magazines, and so on, to keep visibility of our hero. And then eighthly, deification of Hirose as a god of war, in terms of building the Hirose Shrine, or helping to support build of this shrine. Now, I'm going to show you some evidence now of what Ogasawara did, and in his highly targeted and single-minded myth-making of Hirose. Single-minded way to ensure that very important early stages of the heroic myth-making of Hirose would be most effectively carried out. So this is Hirose's instructions that he sent out to the heads of fleet of naval stations around Japan during the war. Biographies of the war dead must be left not only for their honor, but for posterity. Moreover, they will be regarded as model soldiers, Gunshin no Kikan in Japanese, for later generations, and as such, they are an important record for compiling war history. Therefore, at the time of death, comrades in arms must record first-hand witness accounts. So in addition to fighting wars, they now have to look for evidence of war heroes and so on. So what was supremely important about Hirose's death was the manner in which he died. So how he died was actually the most important thing. And because this was exactly the perfect death that Ogasawara had been looking for. So this is an eyewitness account of the moment of Hirose's death. He died in search for his subordinate in the dramatic sinking of the Fukuimaru, which is the ship on which he was a captain of which he was captain. As the Fukuimaru lay sinking, Hirose noticed that his much trusted subordinate, Superior Warrant Officer Sugino, was nowhere to be seen. Hirose went back to the ship, searching for him 3 times, calling out, "Where's Sugino? Sugino, Sugino?" His calls heard by all who anxiously waited for him in the boat, ready to make the last-minute dash away under a rain of shells. One of the shells hit him directly on his head. Hirose was blown into smithereens, leaving only a coin-sized flesh and a map splattered with his blood. So this type of high-quality information that Ogasawara was keen to collect, and this was the type, and have his colleagues help him to look out for. So henceforth, Hirose's relic would consist of this coin-sized piece of flesh and the map splattered with his blood. Now, I'm going to show you two photographs, images of, and two contrasting images of Japanese postcards. So this postcard has Hirose's depiction in his heroic pose, looking for his subordinate, Sugino, moments before his death. So you have Hirose on the top, I should use this one. I think it's this one. Sorry. So this is Hirose, and this is Sugino here. And it would be good to remember the basically juxtaposition of these two figures, because you will see this again later when we come to the statue. So this is quite an important sort of composition in terms of the Hirose myth, because obviously it shows the hierarchical relationship, but yet he is looking, and in fact, he's not looking at the right place. You see, he's looking that way, and he's there. Sugino is right there. Now, this is a postcard of the Russian Admiral Stepan Makarov. And he's here, obviously, and he dies on the 13th of April, 1904. So just a little bit after Hirose. And so the Japanese were very keen, actually, also to depict enemy admirals and generals, because one of the main reasons for this is to show that the Japanese were fighting the European power. So it is sort of like Japan's almost like an elevation to Western power status. And, sorry. So the thing about these two images is that they both, in some sense, depict heroes, as you see. You know, Hirose, the first one, and Makarov, the second one. But the way they position themselves are very different, right? Because Hirose is sort of having this, like, he's kind of like this, you know. And Makarov is going like this. So it's that sort of his hands up, giving up, almost surrendering. So this pose is actually a kind of, significant indirect way of messaging that the Russian admiral was giving up to the Japanese campaign or attack in Port Harbor. Now, Ogasawara is very busy, and he decides to circulate generally this very important telegraph that the deputy commander of the combined fleet sent to the Naval General Staff on the 29th of March, 1904, only 2 days after Hirose's death. So this is actually an internal, high-level telegraph, but Ogasawara takes the decision to actually release it more generally. And so what it says here is also very important. So I'm going to read it. Commander Hirose, who had died an honorable war death at the occasion of the blockade of the mouth of Port Arthur, had shown himself both in his daily conduct and in conduct since the beginning of the war as a true model soldier. There are some who call him a god of war, and we believe that this is not an exaggeration. Especially the telegraph from the commander of the combined fleet to the Navy minister mentioned the courageous and calm action at the moment of his war death. The group of us who survived him, i.e. Hirose, cannot but express wholeheartedly and passionately our compassion. We wish that measures be taken so that we do not ever forget the tales of contributions he made to the Navy as the model soldier for future generations. Now, obviously, this paragraph is particularly important because it included the key terms in the creation of the war myth, which is the model soldier, the honorable war death, and the god of war. So these words from henceforth began to get repeated quite often in lots of different mediums, in the official telegraphs and official notices, as well as in the public media, and so on. And so, although I have not found the direct evidence, I think it is very likely that Ogasawara actually drafted the telegraph himself, because otherwise he would be standing next saying, put that in, you know. So I'm sure he probably drafted it and then sent it, and they thought, okay, that's fine. But anyway, I don't have evidence to say this. But after all, Ogasawara was supported by Admiral Togo, who was the most senior admiral in the Imperial Navy. So that Ogasawara could feel very secure and confident in what he did in this myth creation. Right, so you may still be wondering why Hirose? So why was this, why Hirose, right? Now, so why was this the heroic death that Ogasawara had been looking for? So Hirose did not die from what one might call a narcissistic death, or a more conventionally brave death, any action that resulted in the death of the enemy, like charging into the enemy. Instead, he died in search of his subordinate. And this was a new type of war hero for the Japanese, because it's a new type of bravery that Ogasawara was keen to emphasize, because he believed that the modern Navy needed to have at its core the trust between officers and sailors if it were to succeed. So Navy was an entirely new institution from the Army. Successful naval battles were not based on individual heroism, but on a collective effort. So Ogasawara was the first to recognize this new challenge that faced the Imperial Navy, of how to create a heroic war myth for the Navy without a precedent in the long history of Japanese warrior culture, which focused exclusively on land-based warrior heroes. So the next stage was to make sure that an elaborate ritual was organized to transport his coffin or relic box. It's a tiny box with the things that I said to you before in it, once the battleship Fukuimaru arrives back to the naval port in Sasebo in Kyushu. The railway journey, again from last week, if you remember, throughout Japan was a crucially important element of making the Japanese people aware of the new naval war hero. So the funerary pageantry of Commander Hirose takes a long time, from the 2nd of April all the way up to the 13th of April. It's not every day that things are happening, but this is the period in which the entire process takes place. So on the 2nd of April, Hirose's relic in a small box arrives in Sasebo Naval Port. It is welcomed by 100 naval officers and sailors, and this small box is wrapped up in a black cloth. And the funeral cortege consisting of cavalry, military police, and this procession walked for 50 minutes around this city, which isn't very big, so they had to walk probably very slowly. And the roads were lined up with local mourners, including children. And then there was a naval band playing the funeral kind of march, tune. And the coffin, when it got to the Sasebo railway station, was placed in the first-class carriage on a train bound for Shinbashi Station in Tokyo. So this train arrives in Tokyo on the 5th of April, and now it's met by a very distinguished group consisting of the Navy top brass, Tokyo mayor, and in the waiting room of the Shinbashi Station, Hirose's niece, Keiko, is waiting for his dead uncle to arrive. And then, after this meeting, it is the Ministry of Navy's two-horse carriage takes this coffin, this little box, to Hirose's brother's house in Tokyo, because his older brother, is also a naval officer. And the streets are lined up with thousands of children, and there are lots of photographs of these evidence. Now, I'm just going to show you this map again, because this is the map I showed you last week. And what's very interesting this time is that the funeral process, this is Sasebo 24. And so Hirose's carriage goes all the way through, and it goes past Hiroshima 21, Okayama, Kyoto 16, and goes all the way to number 10, Tokyo. So this journey is 1,195 kilometers. So last week we saw a lot of journeys going to Hiroshima, which was sometimes about the same length. So the railway journeys, one way or another, actually play an incredibly important part of the domestic or the home front in Japan. Now, on the 13th of April, the official funeral of Hirose takes place as an official Ministry of Navy funeral. And an imperial emissary is sent for the very first time for this level of state funeral. And a grand funeral cortege, and the coffin is followed by the Navy minister. And remember, Hirose was a totally unknown naval officer when he died. He was an officer, but he was not a well-known officer. 250 guards of honor. And when the cortege passed by the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, if you've been to Tokyo, you might know where it is. Foreign visitors, newspapers reported that foreign visitors who were staying at the Imperial Hotel came out to pay respects to the procession. But the reality, we don't know the truth, whether that's what they did, or whether they just came out to see what the fuss was, But it was noted that in this procession, the beautiful sakura petals were kind of blowing in the spring wind. And if you know anything about Japanese, warrior culture and all that, sakura, or the cherry blossoms, is a very important warrior symbol, and of the fleeting nature of life, particularly of that of a warrior, and the impermanence of life. Now, at the Aoyama Funeral Hall, this cortege was joined by 100 foreign correspondents who were actually all in Japan at that time covering the Russo-Japanese War. So the Russo-Japanese War was a very heavily covered war by the Western press. So almost like all the major newspapers sent war correspondents to Japan during the war. And of course, foreign diplomats. And this is a very important thing to have the foreign group there, because it actually indicates something. And then at this occasion, a vice admiral commented, "Hirose must be a very fortunate man to have the foreign minister as his funeral receptionist. So thank goodness there's some humor left in this whole thing. But anyway, Hirose is buried in Aoyama Cemetery with tombstone engraved with this famous poem, which I'm going to show you in the subsequent slide, which had been since cited countless times in pre-war Japanese society. So with that, I could be born 7 times and sacrifice my life for my country. Resolved to die, my mind is firm, and again expected to win success. Smiling, I go on board. So this was reputedly composed by Hirose just a few days before his death. Now, if you know Japanese literature, you might have come across Soseki, Natsume Soseki, who is one of the most famous modern writers of Japan. And he said, to put it bluntly, the commander's poem is not just very bad, but extremely banal. The Hirose statue, now we move on to the creation of the Hirose statue, the official commemoration of the naval hero, which happened in May 1910. So, immediately after Hirose's death, so as early April 1904, there is a proposal to build or create a bronze statue to be funded by the Navy. So obviously it's a Navy-initiated initiative. Plus, they said they were going to make a special exception this time and open it to public subscription. So the public can also donate money and be part in the process of creating this bronze statue. So this is actually quite an important thing that the Navy tried to do, which was to bring the public in to the myth-making. And this is also part of the Meiji government's policy to commemorate national heroes with bronze statues. So, you know, there were quite a lot of bronze statues in Japan. Now, the unveiling of unveiling of the statue, as I said, happened on the 25th of May, 1910. And this statue was situated basically by one of the big bridges in Japan called Mansei Bridge, which is in the Kanda area of Tokyo. And this, incidentally, end of May, is the commemoration of the Battle of the Sea of Japan, which was basically the most important naval date for the Japanese Imperial Army, and also became a very important date for naval pageantry. And what's very important to realize at this point is that there was an intense competition between the Navy and the Army on pageantries. So Army's doing something, and the Navy does something, and Army does something. So most of this 1910s and 1920s is actually about this thing, going back and forth. The two armed forces really trying to outdo each other. Now, the unveiling ceremony I'm going to show you the statue. The unveiling ceremony actually was attended by Admiral Togo, who was probably the most famous actual hero from the Russo-Japanese War. He was the admiral who fought in the Battle of the Sea of Japan, which basically concluded the Russo-Japanese War. And the Navy Minister, again, all the important dignitaries of the Navy, and 3 imperial princesses begged to attend this ceremony. So they were allowed to attend. And over 1,000 invited guests. So this is the bridge and the area around the bridge, and it's just mobbed with people, if you can imagine that. And the statue was covered in this was actually covered when the guests and people arrived in red and white sheet. And it was unveiled by Hirose's great niece, Keiko, who was 17 at the time, and Sugino's 14-year-old son. So the whole families have been mobilized in this event, as you can well imagine. And the sculptor was a man called Watanabe Osamu from Hirose's hometown Bungo Takeda in Kyushu. And as you know, he only lived there for 9 years, but the connection between his hometown and Tokyo became absolutely crucial. And in all this miscreation, official side of miscreation, where he actually kind of grew up and had his first beginnings, which was Takayama in the Gifu Prefecture, basically doesn't figure very much at all. It's basically the Kyushu and the Tokyo sort of sites that matter to the official miscreation. Statue was 10 meters high, and you see the composition here from the postcard. Hirose on the top and Sugino at the bottom. And when it was unveiled, Admiral Togo apparently said, "Oh, Hirose," and then he shed a tear or two. And he said, "This statue will, in years to come, demonstrate the spirit of the time by imparting the lesson untold," whatever that meant. But anyway, 600 official guests, so there was 1,000 in the beginning, but 600 of them were invited to feast in this huge restaurant, which obviously had to kind of, I don't know how they catered for 600 people. But, so they were busy eating inside. And then outside, 3,000 students came to kind of, to sing songs and celebrate this occasion. And then the local fire brigade of this Kanda area decided to do this kind of dance, singing and dancing, clanking and all this. And essentially what happened was this event turned into a really rather big, wild celebration by the people. And so in pre-war Japan, you often see circumstances where, because the state is so keen to celebrate these and have these pageantries, and people have to participate, because without the people, pageantry simply does not work. So people kind of take the opportunity to come out on the streets and celebrate slightly wildly than usual. Because this is the time where you have sake, you can have nice things to eat, and you can be jolly. And so there is a very fine line between pageantry, celebration, and potential chaos by the crowd. So what's quite important is that the state was very worried about this kind of celebrations because what happens if it goes overboard and erupts into a riot? It could, this kind of carnivalesque kind of idea. But anyway, this was one occasion where it was really quite touch and go. It could have gone either way. Now, the really funny thing actually about this whole pageantry is in the evening, the Navy got out the search torch. And this was seen to be the state-of-the-art technology at the time. So they were very proud to bring it out and basically shine onto the statue. But the statue was too high, so they couldn't see Hirose. They only could see Sugino at the bottom. And so there was this like, where is our hero? Where is our hero? Ha ha ha, he's actually dead in the sea, So there's this sort of thing going on. And anyway, this somehow, without a major incident, this pageantry ended. And just to add that this is the most official important statue built by the Navy. But before that, in March 1905, his kind of town where he grew up, Hida Takayama, they built a statue of him in the castle grounds. And then in 1912, another statue was built in Kyushu's hometown, in Bungo Takeda. So they're all wanting to have him. And he's our hero, no, he's our hero. This kind of thing going on. Now, you've all seen this Japanese print, because this is the main thing for this lecture series. So now I'm going to talk about the iconography of Hirose, which was full of symbols of technological modernity and modern masculinity. For us, this looks like a very nice old Japanese print. But at the time, this was actually representing state-of-the-art technology. So if you can try to think like that. Anyway, so let's look at this print, which in Japanese is called Nishikie. And Kobayashi Kiyochika was the print artist. And he was particularly famous for a very successful series of prints on the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95 and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05. And the Russo-Japanese War for Japanese printmaking was actually the very last end of the Japanese sort of long history of Japanese printmaking. So in the Russo-Japanese War, postcards, as you saw, quite a lot of postcards already, become more important as a medium of sort of visual culture in Japan. So anyway, Kobayashi does one, or two or three actually, of Hirose. And Hirose is depicted quite a lot in whatever Japanese prints that you might actually find of the war. So in this print, he is looking fierce, courageous, and determined, standing on this half-broken deck of a ship, and his heroic presence in the dark, stormy sea, illuminated possibly by searchlights or just by the fire. But this actually looks... Anyway, at the time, the fascination with naval technology was a universal phenomenon. It's not just in Japan. You know, Britain, Germany, all these countries were really big on naval technologies. And there was this competition in the kind of early 1900s, late 1890s on this, you know, Anglo-German naval rivalry and so on. So Navy equals technology. And everybody in the world, in terms of like where they actually had any navies, they were really fascinated by huge modern ships. Because they thought these ships were the embodiment of technological innovation and scientific progress, icons of the rationality and efficiency of the machine age. So this fascination with the naval hardware explains why the people of the time, contemporaries, were spellbound by the Battle of the Sea of Japan. And this, maybe to us, is quite hard to imagine and appreciate, but this was a major naval battle. And it's often said that it was the last big naval battle in history. And so people who are naval historians see the Russo-Japanese War as the last of the old warfare, 19th century. And because that's where Navy really mattered in the war. And the Battle of the Sea of Japan, if you can sort of imagine the spectacle of 85 warships sinking each other. And this is the kind of thing, so you can imagine loads of postcards were published on this theme. Now, Hirose was an icon of modern masculinity at the same time. And his virility is expressed through his physicality. So he's kind of, I guess in some sense quite typical of the heroic poses that you might even see of medieval warriors. There's this sort of like this kind of look of determination. And his poses, as you saw in some of the things I showed you. And George Mossey, I know somebody in the audience last week raised George Mossey, who's worked a lot on the Great War, the First World War. So he talks about the aesthetics of masculinity. And he said that basically the masculine ideal had to also involve beauty. So our hero has to be a really handsome man It cannot be just an ordinary looking man. And this kind of principle was, in some sense, what also made Hirose a very attractive hero for the Navy, or for Ogasawara. And because as you saw this kind of image and his photographs in the beginning, Hirose actually was what the Navy wanted to project at its self-image. And he was a dashing officer, let's say, with a Western mustache, and when you look at the images of the Japanese officers of the time, there's hardly any difference between Japanese officers and Western officers. So this is another thing, that through images and representative images of masculinity or war heroes, they are trying to basically put Japan on the par with Western heroes and Western powers. So if we can sort of think of Hirose as the equivalent of the modern technology plus modern masculinity, him in this person representing these two very important aspects, and at the same time, Hirose was a personification of the Navy. Okay, so popular cultural icon, and I think time is rapidly passing. Let's just look at, so Hirose became extremely popular in Japanese popular culture. And one of the reasons was that there was this modern hero, who is of our period, who can now sort of almost like supplant the medieval war heroes. Because as much as Japanese people liked hearing about medieval war heroes, it's kind of nice to have a new modern hero, a new face to this old kind of system of how, patriotic stories and martial stories were told. So Hirose myth injected this fresh, up-to-date material to reflect Japan's international wars into the indigenous popular genres of entertainment, such as naniwabushi, which is epic recitations made with three-stringed shamisen, and kodan, storytelling, and even kabuki plays. And then there was also a genre called biwa uta, or lute songs, and they were creating new materials for this, and they were called new Meiji stories. And Commander Hirose became one of the famous titles of the Satsuma-style lute song. And this is just like 2 sentences here. Loyal soul never dies, but returns to protect the country and the emperor. There was the lord, Kusunoki, who's a medieval warlord, in the past, and now there is Hirose. So there's this direct linking of Hirose with the medieval warlord, warlord Kusunoki. Anyway, so the representation of Hirose was very important in the contemporary incarnation of the medieval warrior ethics of the noblest kind. So what it does is that it reveals the strength of traditional stereotypes of war heroes in Japanese culture at the time, in spite of Navy's attempts to bring in a modern version of a war hero. They just really liked Hirose, so they just adopted him into this traditional rigid cultural representations. So Hirose's representations in the traditional genres actually were, generally speaking, quite one-dimensional, because it followed a particular sort of pattern in the existing culture. Okay, so the very last little thing I'm going to mention is actually about the Hirose Shrine. So this exists in Japan today. So if you're interested, you can go and look at it in Kyushu. And it is in his home, or native town where he was born, Bungo Taketa. And so in the 1930s, after the Manchurian invasion of 1931, basically Japanese society becomes increasingly focused on wars, possible future wars. And so there was the creation of the association to establish the Hirose Shrine in October 1931. And the interesting thing was that this association was initiated and headed by Admiral Arima, who actually was the chief priest of the Yasukuni Shrine, which is the shrine that basically deifies the war dead. And it's actually the controversial shrine in Japan. If you follow any of the sort of Sino-Japanese Korea politics, diplomacy over the war dead from the Second World War. Now, so on the 25th of May, 1935, the Hirose Shrine is established in this place, which again is the 30th anniversary of the of the Battle of the Sea of Japan. So Hirose goes in a very nice way. It's sort of associated with various naval battles, and also, most importantly, with the Battle of the Sea of Japan. Now, there was a coordination of nationwide commemoration events. The Imperial Reservist Association ceremony at the Hirose statue in Tokyo took place. Naval cadets hoisted the Z flag, which is the famous flag on battleship Mikasa from the Battle of the Sea of Japan, on top of Mount Fuji. And then there was a 2-day ceremony covering of this shrine opening, covered in the national newspapers. So finally, Hirose becomes an official protected god, Gokoku, of the Oita Prefecture, Kyushu. So the biggest irony in this creation of the Hirose Shrine was that the Navy had been really making him into a national hero, right? All this period. And then when the shrine is established, he becomes a local protector god and not a national protector god. And anyway, after 1945, when Japan loses the war, the shrine becomes a religious corporation, which is like what happened to everything else, all the shrines. So anyway, this is Hirose Tomoko, who's a great niece of Hirose, whom 20 years ago, when I went to do research there, she was actually still running the shrine. And this most lovely woman, and there's obviously a huge amount of materials of Hirose held by the shrine, which is not yet accessed by the public or researchers. Now, very, very quickly, so what can we say? Why was he created? You probably know by now why he was created into a myth. The most important thing is actually that the Imperial Navy was in the process of creating a distinct and separate identity from the Imperial Army, because Navy used to be part of the Army before the Russo-Japanese War. So after the war, it actually fought really hard institutionally to remain independent and separate. So if you think of it as almost like an institutional politics, institutional rivalry, then you can understand why they paid so much effort, money, time into the creation of Hirose myth. Now, they wanted to create a new heroic myth on Hirose to embody the modern characteristics of the Imperial Army. So a new form of bravery, as you saw, saving his subordinate, a cosmopolitan identity of Hirose. Sorry, I forgot to actually say that I said he spent 5 years in Russia. During that time, he got to know the Russian elite actually quite well. And there was even a little story about him and a Russian aristocratic young woman. And that, they sort of fell in love with each other. But Hirose said that he had to go and serve the country, so he could not marry this Russian aristocrat called Ariadne Kavalevsky. And anyway, so there's that side of him which is very international, cosmopolitan, and he represented this modern masculinity, yet imbued with the sort of, more traditional sense of Japanese martial spirit. And why? Because he was expert at judo. So there are lots of elements which were put together to create this myth. So the one last thing is what do we think of him as a myth? Was he a success? Well, it was a success in a sense that pre-war Japan was essentially filled with his, his stories in various forms, official, unofficial, popular, what have you. But it only lasted as long as the Imperial Navy lasted. So after Japan's defeat, obviously, Imperial Army and Imperial Navy kind of visually disappeared. And so Hirose also disappeared. And Hirose's statue in Manseibashi was taken down during the war to melt it because it was a bronze statue, because they needed every metal they could find. So he was actually melted down during the war. And anyway, so what makes his myth most fascinating, at least for me as a researcher, is its very multifaceted nature, that, he was embodying both the modern and traditional elements. And what he did also, because of all these very complex interplay of things happening into this creation of the myth, he was actually also reflecting the generally complex nature of Japanese society at the time, because it had lots of different elements. You can't say Japan was very traditional, Japan was very modern, because of a mixture of everything. And I think his myth and the complexity and tensions within his myth represent incredibly well this complex nature of Japanese society. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think you did it again, sort of fascinate us so that we didn't see the hour, sort of pass by, And now we have very little time for questions, but I must say I find it, really fascinating listening to you, because in a way, I mean, you take us sort of backwards in what we know. I mean, at least I know of Japanese modern history through, as I said, literature and cinema. Recently, I happened to see that film by this rather controversial filmmaker called I think his name is Wakamatsu. Koji Wakamatsu, and the film is entitled Caterpillar in the Japanese pronunciation, and well, I mean, you just wonder what a caterpillar, sort of has to do in this film about precisely a war hero. In fact, it's a soldier who lost all his members. I mean, his both arms and legs, and so there's only the body left, without any members, and so he has to crawl like a caterpillar. And of course, I mean, it's a sort of devastating debunking of the war hero ideal, because he has to be drawn in a cart. I mean, because he can't walk, and anyway, and so you take us back. I mean, to the origin of this myth, and. If I may, I'd like to ask you a bit more about, you started right away talking about the suicide missions on Port Arthur. Would that be the ancestors of the kamikaze sort of suicide missions, or because we all heard about Pearl Harbor, sort of those...
and the kamikaze, yeah.
So is that the same kind of? I mean, does it go back as far as 1904? I mean, those missions.
Yeah. So Keshitai was. I mean, it's basically to do. Kamikaze, in some sense, is a similar thing. Kamikaze actually used that name, right, from the Mongolian invasion times. So that goes back like nearly 1,000 years kind of thing. But Keshitai was, it's that thing about a mission which you have to go essentially with the determination that you might actually die from that. Of course, not everybody dies, right? So this is why the result of the kechita of the first blockade, actually they're alive, and Hirose was one of them. So, but it's that sort of like it's a sort of signaling of how serious attempt this is, that we are all willing to, prepared to die for this mission. But the end product is that some people die, other people don't. And just because some people don't die, it doesn't mean that they have to die as a result. They come back alive, then they get reconfigured into the second blockade, like that. So I think it's, I'm not sure if the connotation is as heavy as kamikaze pilots, for example, in the Second World War. And in this period, basically, it's very important to remember that the Navy, in particular, was very keen not to project the old warrior ethics and samurai ethics. This is why Sugino, this Hirose myth, is actually to do with this importance of the hierarchical camaraderie between the officer and the sailors. So it's kind of, you see, this is why it's quite complex, because depending on where you stand and how you see this term, keshitai, you might actually think, I don't think you're wrong at all, actually, to think that it might have to do with this, let's say, age-old kind of bushy, warrior thing. But from the point of view of the Navy, it's not necessarily the case that they actually want people to just die, because they have to basically stay alive to fight the war. So this is the big thing about the Russo-Japanese War in particular, that you essentially couldn't really, although they came up with this word like we talked about last week, honorable war death, that yes, you have to go and fight, and if you die, you will become an honorable war dead. But at the end of the day, if too many soldiers die, you can't fight the war. So there's the paradox, I don't know if I answered your question, but...
Yes. Yeah, because I was wondering, you kept asking why Hirose, why did we pick that guy, in particular, while he didn't die that... sort of kamikaze's death.
That's right.
He was just killed by a shell.
And
in a very sort of banal way, and so that's interesting. Just for my own information, is it known when? Probably it's known when the Japanese Navy and Army started, sort of adopting the Western uniform, because obviously the naval officers are dressed like Western naval officers, and the army as well. Yeah. So when was that?
It's very early. Very early. I don't know the exact period, but it's
even in the Sino-Japanese War of 1895. They were already sort of dressed in.
It's either pretty much immediately after the Meiji Restoration, or it's definitely way before the Sino-Japanese War, because it's to do with the representation of the modern army. That's also very important, and also if you see some of the very few prints from the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, when essentially the kind of, this was in some sense a very, very tragic battle, like a little civil war in Japan that happened between the last remnants of the samurai strongholds in the Kyushu area in particular, and the modern army forces of the Meiji government. Basically, they went to quell this rebellion in Kyushu, and the reason why it's so tragic is because the modern Japanese Navy and Army were, particularly the officer levels, often came from Kyushu, Satsuma, that area, Satsuma, Choshu area. So they were sort of killing their own kind of comrades, former comrades, that kind of thing. So anyway, but if you see the prints, you will see the Meiji government army represented in Western, and rebels in their sort of, you know, the kimono kind of, you know, traditional wear.
Yeah. And you have the same kind of representation. I mean, I remember a print, you know, sort of featuring some Japanese officers all dressed in Western uniforms, and the Manchu, you know, troops. You see, I mean, sort of surrendering to them, sort of kowtowing to them, and all sort of dressed in their gowns and long sleeves and everything.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely. And Sino-Japanese War particularly used that sort of contrast between the Japanese Navy or Army and the Chinese Army. So in that sense, that was a very sort of, you know, very crude way of showing the difference. And that Japan was, you know, basically become a Western style power, whereas the Chinese were still this kind of traditional, you know, styled kind of army, you know. So these prints actually had quite a lot of influence because this is something that most people would see. It's not a rarefied thing. It was a lot in circulation at the time in popular culture. And the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95 was extremely important because like what's really important to remember is how important China has been in Japan's sort of history, right? Because China is like this huge power, huge civilization where most of the Japanese kind of, you know, writing everything sort of came through China, through the Korean Peninsula, comes to Japan. So that sort of like, I don't know how you call it, like...
sort of weighs down on the...
You know, but that sense of indebtedness to China in terms of civilizational kind of thing gets like broken off overnight because of the Sino-Japanese War. And so that's why that war had an incredibly symbolic significance on the Japanese mind, you know,
Yeah, and it has a, you know, decisive, you know, sort of effect on China because, I mean, just years after the defeat against Japan really, in 1898, I mean, the very first attempt at reforming the political regime, you know, was you know, sort of carried out. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes malheureusement obligés d'en rester là. Donc, rendez-vous la semaine prochaine. Hein. Je crois que vous êtes tous accros là maintenant, comme moi. et donc, merci d'être venus et bonne fin de journée. À bientôt.
Thank you very much. Thank you.